Okay, we're going to get started again. Thanks for coming back in. We're obviously a full house today. We appreciate everyone's patience moving around. I am delighted to introduce to you Ambassador Marta Bárcena, the Mexican ambassador to the United States. I'll tell you a little bit about her from her bio and then make a couple of brief comments before we jump into the conversation. Ambassador Bárcena is the first female ambassador of Mexico to the United States. She's been a member of the Foreign Service for a long time in Mexico as a professional in her trajectory. She's been in the Foreign Service since 1979, including many important posts, but among those, ambassador to the Kingdom of Denmark, ambassador to the Republic of Turkey, non-resident ambassador to Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan. Most recently, she was a permanent representative of Mexico to the United Nations. And I have to say, from the first time that I met Ambassador Bárcena here in Washington and spoke with her, she talked about her desire to focus on the U.S. Mexico border, focus on it as a place of opportunity and a bright spot in a troubled relationship in some ways, but definitely as a global economic powerhouse and a really just vitally key important part of this relationship. So I, doing a lot of work on the U.S. Mexico border, obviously immediately liked her and was very happy to have her here. She's always, of course, been aware that border issues also include another set of issues, a set of security challenges, and that she'd be in charge of managing security cooperation from here in Washington, that immigration issues would be a part of her job here in Washington. I don't know if she expected that they would explode to sort of begin to overwhelm everything else in some ways, and the conversation has happened over the last month or so. But I think there's... It's that much more important why you're here today with us to have this conversation about the border. I mean, we really value in this room from the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center, from the Border Trade Alliance, and I know speaking on behalf of so many people here that represent and live in border communities, we really value this opportunity to have a conversation that's not just about what's in the headlines, but that really is about a vision for the border that is an integral, holistic vision, understanding all the value that the border brings to the table for both the United States and Mexico. So thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation and to really put together a thoughtful presentation for us about where we can be seeing the border moving forward in the bilateral relationship.
Thank you.
Please take the podium.
I'm going to.
Thank you.
Thank you. And as Chris said, I am very much into the border issues. I feel part of the border. I will start telling you an anecdote. My grandmother was born in Laredo. So, good. The daughter of a French grandfather and an American grandmother. And she was taken to Mexico at the beginning of the Mexican Revolution with no papers. And she lived all her life undocumented in Mexico until she passed away in San Luis Potosí. So, blood from the border is in my veins. My great-grandfather was Abraham Lincoln's consul in Matamoros during the Civil War. So I have a call for the border. And today it's a very special day to be here today. Just one day after the Mexican Senate ratified USMCA by 114 votes in favor, 4 abstentions and 4 votes against it, and 3 abstentions. It was ratified by a wide margin. And it was ratified, as President López Obrador has said, to send the right signals to our partners in North America. We are a responsible government. Everybody agrees that USMCA will give certainty and predictability for our relations in the future. And we have the right legal framework to go ahead. And that is why, in spite of different considerations about the timing of ratification, the Mexican Senate decided to go ahead and ratified it, because we want to cement this message that we are responsible and we look for certainty and for predictability. But I want to share with you ideas on how to expand the vision of the Mexican-U.S. border region. One of the main setbacks that we have faced in defining a lasting vision of our border is that it tends to be analyzed under narrow perspective or specific problems that prevent us from understanding the border as a whole. Ordinary Americans, not from the border, from the rest of the country, hear single stories about the border that often fail to capture its complexities and its opportunities. Any vision that intends to look into the future needs a careful consideration of the past in order to give coherence to the present situation of the border. The history of the border is so rich that the existence of communities on both sides even predates the notion of Mexico and the United States as the nation states that are today. From the 16th century on, there was this process of going up to the north after the fall of Mexico City and of this colonization of those territories by the Spaniards. Forts were established, missions were established by members basically of the Franciscans and Jesuits orders in the territories that are now part of our common border, in all the states that are the border. The names of many of these missions and forts are still the names of the cities of those part of the US and the border. So we know that in this process, the Native Americans on both sides of the borders were deeply affected. And we know that it was not an easy process. We just have to remember the rebellion in New Mexico in 1682. But we managed to have this system that is the basis of what today are the border states and the border region. After the Mexican-American War, the members of the joint U.S. and Mexican Boundary Commission that oversaw the Commission's work on the western boundary line had difficulty imagining how a steep and rocky terrain with freezing temperatures in the mountains and a scorching heat in the desert could become a productive part of a country. According to historian Rachel St. John, in 1851, Dr. Thomas Webb, the U.S. Commission's secretary, declared that the territory at the western border was worthless for any purpose than to constitute a barrier of natural line of demarcation between two neighboring nations. However, at the beginning of the 20th century, international capital and binational railroad network fostered a new understanding of the border and created new transborder ties. The realities on the ground made it clear that the only way to achieve the most basic common goals, such as marking the border, suppressing transborder raids, and facilitating the flow of trade and investment, required the adoption of binational strategies. Cooperation became a must. Cooperation became a necessity for both Mexican and Americans. As the border experienced dramatic changes and took on new meanings, we managed to turn this necessity into spirit of binational cooperation. This spirit that has prevailed at the border is the best part of the story of U.S.-Mexico relations. The very same existence of this valuable conference is a perfect example of this binational cooperation. Increasingly, legitimate security concerns, but also grim tales about the border, have managed to capture the narrative of one of the busiest and most frequently crossed international borders in the world. And people forget this. If the border were so lawless, we would not have this increasing trade and crossings. Mexico is convinced that the security of the border is fundamental because it cannot thrive without the most basic security guarantees. However, while the security focus helps us see many things, what it hides is crucial. Our border is an environment of opportunity defined by social and commercial exchanges and of a common natural landscape. Yes, the border is a customs and immigration checkpoint, but it is way more than that. At different times, the border is a marker of national identities, a site of transborder trade, a home to binational, bicultural, and bilingual communities, and also a symbol of our economic stature as a region. Together, the 10 border states, if they were a separate nation, would constitute the world's fourth largest economy, and according to some data, the third largest economy in the world. Also, 23 US states count Mexico as their #1 or #2 export market, including the 4 border states of California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. This is also the size and relevance of our border. When we talk about the border, we're also talking about us, people. We're talking about people that move, that invest, that shop, that socialize across the boundary line. When we talk about the border, we talk about ranchers, railroad builders, miners, investors, and immigrants. We talk about thousands of people who cross the border every single day in both directions to work, conduct business, attend school, or get medical treatment. It is a paradox that a narrative of a lawless, out-of-control border has become part of the political language at a time when San Isidro, San Diego, El Chaparral, Tijuana is the busiest land border crossing in the world, and that the Port of Laredo has become the first port of entry for the US, and Nogales and FAR, the largest ports of entries for the exchange of fruits and vegetables. A dysfunctional border would not be able to deal with this. A dysfunctional border without intense cooperation that Mexican and US authorities have managed to achieve would never be able to successfully manage our numbers. 57 ports of entry, 80% of our bilateral trade, daily crossings of 1 million people, 425,000 vehicles, and 30,000 trucks, not to talk about the railroads going, trains going up and down all the time. San Diego and Tijuana, Cali Baja, are in fact increasingly linked. Both cities have become a hub not only for manufacturing but for services, with a strong presence of high technology businesses. As you well know, the Tijuana airport is the world's first geographically binational airport, as its cross-border terminal connects with Otay Mesa in San Diego. The Mexican government understands that a border with solid infrastructure will boost the competitiveness and prosperity of our region. That is why President López Obrador has given an special attention to the northern border, with a special program to lower the taxes and to lower the prices of gas and give other incentives for this competitiveness. A prosperous border will attract more trade and tourism. It will foster the creation of more jobs, and it will generate a positive impact on the living standards of our peoples on both sides of the border. With this in mind, we have worked on a number of joint projects that tell the other part of the story of cooperation. Both our governments share the objective of promoting greater economic competitiveness and security. For these reasons, we work together through the 21st Century Border Management Initiative that was established in 2010, and that we will continue to work in that framework for the future. And the Binational Bridges and Border Crossing Group, established in 1983, and that has been working since then, and that have allowed us to identify common objectives and common priorities to continue to expand the numbers of ports of entry and to better infrastructure. These two mechanisms regularly monitor and ensure the implementation of specific actions to improve our infrastructure and to facilitate the movement of goods and people in a safe, efficient, expeditious, and lawful legal manner. Our two governments have also been working towards ensuring regional security and expedient inspection procedures. Last year, our countries started implementing the Unified Cargo Processing Program at 13 ports of entry. It has been extremely successful, and it started with an Arizona port of entry, Arizona, Sonora. This unified cargo processing allows officials from Mexico and the United States to conduct joint inspections of cargo in one place at the same time in order to reduce waiting times and increase efficiency in trade. The International Boundaries and Water Commission, or SILA, continues its work all the time, monitoring the situation at the border and working together to address the various challenges at the border, particularly on water sanitation and other issues that we need to work about environmental standards. NatBank has been a very good instrument that was established with the previous NAFTA. Now we have the challenge, as Congressman Cuellar said, to continue to rely in NAFTA. For replenishment, its capital, and to have it, we need to work together in the issue of environment on USMCA to address which are the top priorities of environment, and then link those priorities with the loans and investment that NatBank can do in infrastructure and addressing the environmental concerns. And so we will be able to say, see, we are enforcing our common challenges on environment. We need to use NatBank, and we need to use the International Boundary and Water Commissions. We have the tools, we have the institutions, we just have to use them. And we have to educate, of course, Congress to tell them, you don't need to worry about. You have the tools for the enforcement. We just have to work together on identifying priorities and allocate them the resources that are needed. Furthermore, in 2018, we also signed a series of memoranda of understanding to increase agricultural safeguarding and to combat the illicit flows of goods at the border. Not only drugs to the US, but arms coming from the US to Mexico. This doesn't mean we're ignorant of the significant challenges that remain on the road ahead. We are well aware that the common opportunities that stand before us cannot be fully realized and will not be fully realized without a careful reconsideration of the difficulties that lie ahead. For example, the lands ports of entry that make trade and tourism possible have an outdated or beyond capacity infrastructure in many of them. Also, there are often insufficient numbers of customs and border protection agents to staff the land ports of entry efficiently and adequately. And this is impacting the global value chains that are in North America, particularly the automotive sector. I was surprised to be in Michigan 1 month ago and see the anger of the automotive sector because of the delays at the border, because they are used to work on just in time with one auto part crossing up to 8 times the border on both directions, and the delays was affecting this whole value chain. They were paying fines, they were telling me, of $16,000 US for a minute of delay. So this cannot happen in the future. This should not happen in the future. We also need to stop slowing down or closing down border crossings or lanes to avoid raising costs. We need to work towards the opening of new strategic crossing points. Furthermore, the managing of migration flows from Central America will require a continued dialogue and coordination between Mexican and US authorities. And we need to urgently address all the concerns that the society are having regarding the enormous, enormous burden that the presence of these incredible amount of asylum claimants is having at both sides of the border. These examples allow us to accept the seriousness of the challenges we face and to value the encouraging trends in order to work towards the future. Now, more than ever, we need to increase our dialogue in order to better align our priorities. If we fight, if we have different priorities, everything will be slowed down. If we manage to identify the common challenges and priorities, we can speed up all processes. The history of the border has been a balance between change and continuity. The U.S. Commission's secretary that claimed in 1851 that the territory at the border was worthless for any purpose than to constitute a barrier or natural line of demarcation was proven completely wrong. On the other hand, the consolidation of the idea of cooperation as a necessity, and now it becomes not a necessity, but really, really an asset, that arose at the beginning of the 20th century is perhaps more valid now than ever. If we fail to acknowledge this fact, we will continue to face the same obstacles over and over again. It is up to us to define our approach towards the border. It is up to the border communities. It is up to the border mayors. It is up to the border governors. And it is up to congressmen from the border. And it is up to the federal government in both countries to define our approach towards the border and to our bilateral relationship at large, not by the challenges that we face, but by the prosperity and the opportunities that we can create together. Because as I've been saying with USMCA and the U.S.-Mexico relationship, juntos lo hacemos mejor. And together, we are better. Thank you.
Ambassador, we have a few minutes. Do you mind if we take a couple questions from the audience? If we can get the microphones ready. We've got one question back here in the aisle. Please just identify yourself and then be concise with the question.
Sure thing. My name is Brian Bradley. I'm a reporter for American Shipper. Ambassador, I'm just wondering if you can give me any update on your observations as to whether you feel encouraged with the approval process for USMCA on Capitol Hill right now, based on what we've seen in recent days. Thanks.
Yes, maybe I'm an optimist, an irredentist optimist. So we've been working very closely with both aisles in Congress and particularly focusing our conversations with the Hispanic caucus and with the New Democrats. One message that we have been conveying to our friends is, listen, the ratification of USMCA, it's not only good economically speaking, it will be considered and interpreted as a gesture of friendship towards Mexico and Canada, because it is the basis of the trust relationship that we have been building in the last years. I mean, we have always had this cooperation, but the trust that we have built from the last 25 years, NAFTA has been fundamental and USMCA will be fundamental. So it is my impression that many congressmen and congresswomen and senators understand this. It's just as Speaker Pelosi has been saying, we need to find a path to the yes. And that path to the yes, of course, implies that we address the legitimate concerns of some of congressmen, of some people, and we want to address it. If we and the best proof that we want to address that is the labor reform that we passed. It's 180 degrees change. And it implied a lot of sacrifices and concessions from the private sector of Mexico. And why? Because we believe in this relationship and the future of this relationship. I mean, the secret, democratic, personal vote, the establishment of labor courts, it is really satisfying what the Democrats have been asking since the negotiation of NAFTA. And when they talk about enforcement, we say, okay, enforcement in Mexico means that we have a clear roadmap to implement this legislation and that the budget will come now that the Ministry of Treasury, la Secretaría de Hacienda, is preparing the budget for next year. And the main tool for implementation in Mexico will be the labor courts. No more conciliation and arbitration boards, but labor courts. What can be stronger than labor courts? And on the enforcement within the context of USMCA, we have the dispute settlement mechanisms. We just have to agree to have the list of 30 arbiters for each country and to agree that we will immediately go to this dispute settlement mechanism in case of any difference, including labor and environment. And that is the main instrument for the main tool for enforcement. So maybe it's because there has not been enough dialogue on this that has not been understood. But for us, the enforcement is there. So we hope that with this working group that was established by Speaker Pelosi and that we are already in close contact with them, will be able to to work with us, to work with Canada, to work, of course, and specifically and fundamentally with Ambassador Lighthizer and his team, who has been extremely efficient, and he has been really of the force behind all these, to allay the fears regarding these areas and regarding enforcement. And of course, the best scenario situation for us would be to have the House of Representatives ratified the USMCA or approve it before the August recess. Because if not, also the timing in Canada could get things a little bit more complex.
Thank you very much. This is a fantastic answer. We have time for another question here. Gustavo in the front.
Yes, good morning. This is Gustavo de la Fuente with the
Sí.
San Diego-Tijuana Smart Border Coalition. I had a question about capacity. Mexican border cities, and with asylum seekers going back to Mexico with this Return to Mexico program, what do you believe cities are going to need in terms of a lot of resources? But how is that going to be arranged, Ambassador? What is needed? What kind of cooperation is needed with the United States to actually get the funds and prepare these cities for this onslaught of, I mean, unfortunately, many people?
Yes, you are absolutely right. I mean, this situation will overwhelm our cities at the northern border of Mexico. They are already overwhelmed. And as you know, we have basically been relying on Catholic and religious associations and NGOs taking care of the shelters that have for the shelters for these asylum claimants. What I would say is we are working in several tracks. One track, for example, today is President López Obrador will be meeting the President of El Salvador in Tapachula at our southern border. So we're working with our Central American neighbors to see what we can do so that people do not come to the border as in the numbers that they have been coming, but that they can stay either in Mexico or in the places of origin better. And we are going to incorporate at least Salvador at the beginning with one of the flagship programs of President López Obrador, that it's Sembrando Vida, you know, to plant fruit trees and this. So one track is working with the Central Americans. The second track is that on the Friday, there will be a meeting with all the northern border governors. There was a meeting with the southern border governors last week to see what were the needs also on shelters. And so we will have a meeting, I mean the government, the federal government, with all the northern border governors and mayors to see exactly and try to define what would be the additional needs to deal with this amount of people, of asylum claimants. And because it was President López Obrador himself who put in the political declaration that Mexico will offer access to health, education, and until their asylum claims are adjudicated. On the third track, we are working very closely also with the U.S. authorities on addressing what has been already said here, the increase of immigration judges and the speeding up of the processes, because we can maybe hold people for half a year, 1 year, but not 2 years if the asylum process just goes on and on. So there are very specific and technical conversations that we are having with them, but we see that at least from the U.S. point of view, they are working on this part. And a fourth track is we are also working with the UN system, particularly with UNHCR, the International Organization for Migration, and UNICEF to see how they can support us. Already UNHCR is supporting us, is supporting COMAR, the agency that deals with refugee claims in Mexico. And just for you to know, we are expected to receive this year 60,000 refugee claims in Mexico. Already in the first months of the year, we have received 25,000 claims. Just for you to compare, last year the US only granted 23,000 asylum status. So we are almost, yes, we are really increasing all the claiming of refugee status in Mexico. And we are working with UNICEF, particularly on the issue of unaccompanied minor children. And we are working with IOM because we have some cases in which families already at the northern border want to return to their countries, Honduras, El Salvador, but we don't have the means, or there is no the legal framework to do it, so we will ask IOM to help on this so that they are assisted in their return to their countries. So we're working in different tracks, but of course the collaboration with governors, it would be indispensable, and I think the continuous dialogue of the governors of Mexico with their counterparts is fundamental. In some regions it's more easy, like Baja California, Sonora, Arizona, but then Texas, that has border with many states, is a little bit more complex and complicated. And there the role of mayors can be even more relevant. And I'm sure that we will find a lot of solidarity and comprehension to address the common issues together.
What about, if I can just follow up on that, what about while people are staying in Mexico waiting for their claims to be adjudicated, employment for those? Well, is that something the Mexican government can support? Yes. And I mean, the last time I was in El Paso, one of the things I kept hearing was how tight the labor market is. Yep. in the maquila industry on the Mexican side of the border. Actually spoke with a maquila, someone who runs a maquila, who said that they had accidentally hired some Central Americans when they found out they didn't have work authorization. They had to let them go, but they were very disappointed to do so because of the situation in the labor market.
I forgot to mention, health and education, but the main on the first point was employment. We are going to also address this issue and the possibility, because there are very tight labor markets at the border. One of the challenges, or the main challenge that we have there, is you can have people in Tijuana and you may need them in Matamoros. How do you transport them?
Sure.
And how do you deal with that? And sometimes they don't want to move because they have their asylum claims there. Also, we were thinking of maybe transporting some of the people to inner Mexico, where there are also needs for labor and workforce, like in the Bajío, or even in the southern region. But the problem is that the logistics are a challenge. So we are discussing these possibilities. And at the same time, we are increasing the number of working visas for Central Americans in the southern part of Mexico, with two mechanisms, that is temporary working visa or regional visitor or regional working visa. So as I said, we have a panoply of different options. Some of them are more easier to implement than others. Others will take more time and will take budget and needs. And for the moment, we are relying basically on Mexican resources and the UN system resources. And we will see how we can work in the future with this.
Thank you very much. We're basically at the end. If we have one more question, we might be able to squeeze in, or we can move on to the next panel. Great. Thank you so much, Ambassador Larson.
Thank you.